Hello and welcome back to the Off the Line Performance YouTube channel. Today we are going to be doing a deep dive assembly on an STI motor from 08 plus to current when they cut them off, 21, 22, somewhere around there. But this is going to be extremely applicable to all EJ257s. The only differences are a couple of vacuum pump things and some AVCS gears. We'll get into that when we get to it, but we're going to start here with an RA block. I have some specialty tools that you're going to need before you even want to purchase a block. You're going to want to make sure you have, and then some other things, the tips and tricks and whatnot to get sorted out before you get to this point and end up having to wait with your motor sitting in your garage. So let's start with that. First things first, this is a cam gear tool. This one in particular locates and locks down the inner part of the cam gear. I can show it more later, but you're definitely going to want one of these. Company 23 doesn't produce this one, but they produce other cam gear tools that work just as well. Next thing, also from Company 23, you're going to want a cam gear lockdown tool. This is going to be used to time the vehicle. You can do it by putting some vice grips on the belt in certain areas and sort of getting it timed, but this is way easier, it's way safer. There'd be nothing worse than to get to the point where you're timing your new engine and a gear slips and damages some valves or kisses a piston. You don't want that, so get this nice lockdown tool. I don't have a link or a product name, but if you go on Company 23's website, they'll help you out. And then lastly is a 14 mil 12-point deep socket. This one in particular is from Snap-on, and it's actually a Subaru specific socket, but you're going to need a 12-point impact rated socket. We're going to start with our short block, unpackaging it, and then we'll immediately bolt the heads down just to make sure that nothing gets into the combustion chamber. Everything stays clean, so let's start with that. Subaru block go together?
Yeah.
Yeah? All right, so let's start on the passenger side. It does not matter which side you start on. Obviously, this is your deck surface. You want to make sure that this does not get damaged and that there's nothing dirty, any contaminants in the bores or on the deck surface at all. You want it to be as clean as possible. Along with this customer's build, we're going to be throwing in a set of ARP head studs. The part number on these is 260-4701. We do head studs on just about every single Subaru motor we build, unless it's a naturally aspirated engine that doesn't have a whole lot of power going through it. But anything turbocharged, we always put head studs in. So in your head studs package, you're going to get a bag of washers as well as a bag of nuts. We're going to leave these in their packaging for now, and we'll take out 6 of our head studs, and we are going to paint some ARP fastener lubricant on all of these. And obviously it should go without saying that when you're putting a motor together, you're going to want to make sure that you have a nice clean work surface. I have my teardown table here with some pig mat on top of it to make sure that all of our metal flat surfaces don't get dinged or damaged, but also so that there's no outside contaminants on. I always switch onto a fresh sheet of pig mat before I throw a motor together. We'll start by putting all these head studs in. And I'm just going to get them started, and then we can turn them in with the tool. You don't need to kill these in. Some people prefer to leave them loose in the actual head stud threads, but I like to just get them to where they stop and then just give them a little bit of a turn. The tolerances are actually so tight that sometimes when you run these in, you can hear air hissing past the threads. There is when you torque it, but as far as just putting the fasteners in, no, it doesn't matter what order you do. But thankfully these ARP head studs, they come with a fastening sequence or a torque sequence on the instructions. Okay, those are all in there snug now. Now we're going to take the head out that we need and leave the other one wrapped up, just because we want to keep it as clean as possible for as long as possible. But before we do that, we have an OEM gasket kit. Definitely going to want to have these. It has a lot of stuff in it that you're not going to need in doing a build like we are, where you're sending the motor out and not rebuilding it yourself. So there's like valve seals and guides and all sorts of stuff in these gasket kits that you won't necessarily need for this, but it's still a good idea to get the OEM gasket kit because you know that everything's going to work. And in the gasket kit has our head gaskets. Take this out. Get our head gasket out. Now these head gaskets only go on one way, but they can be put in incorrectly. So the most important thing to look at is there is a oil passage, like a breather passage right here on top. And there's only one spot for it on the top of the motor on each side. So you just have to make sure that that hole lines up. If those line up, then you're perfectly fine. Now we can take the cylinder head out. So before I slap the head on, I'm just going to do a visual inspection, make sure that there's nothing on the deck surface stuck to it or any dings, scratches, or cracks on the deck surface. And these look clean because Alfred always does a killer job. So we're going to go ahead and lay this on. Normally I tilt it up like this to find the first two holes, and then I just kind of rotate it on. Make sure that it seats down in there, and it's good. We're going to do that with just a 10mm socket, and you have to take off these 8 cam carrier bolts and then the 4 on the end for the actual cam seals. Now, as far as these caps, they are identical, so how do you know which one is which? Well, on them they are stamped. We can focus, sort of. Yep. So they're stamped with the cylinder and the intake or exhaust that they go on. So this is the intake and this is the exhaust with an arrow facing the front of the engine so you don't get them mixed up. There, get this out of the way, and we'll take our cams out and place them on the table just for a minute. Now we need to lube up our fasteners. This is by far the dirtiest part of assembling one of these engines because there's not really any good way to get these fasteners lubed up without getting them all over your fingers. So I normally just get it on my fingers anyway. Take all of our washers, take our lube. You're just going to paint a little bit on each side, smear it around with your finger, and then place each one onto one of the head studs. There's no top or bottom to these, so it doesn't matter which way they go in, just as long as each one has a washer. And this fastener lube is extremely important to use because with or without lubricant, it changes the actual torque that you're putting on the fastener. So if ARP knows the compound and the makeup of their fastener lube, they will know that the torque value that they give you to torque the fastener down to will be exactly perfect. Sometimes they can get wedged on a little goofy. In order to fix that though, you just grab a little baby magnet. Get it on there. We'll get our ARP fastener nuts here. That one's tough to get to. Okay, so we have all of our fasteners on. So we're just gonna get these snug by hand, and then we'll get our torque wrench out. The ARP fastener instructions for the head studs is 30, 60, 90 in a certain pattern. You start with the center two and then you do an X pattern on the rest. So I'm just going to follow that while I'm getting these somewhat started. And me personally, I always go about 5 foot-pounds extra on the center two bolts just because they have a little bit more load than the outers. Get our fancy torque wrench out here. Little hot tip, if you have an electronic torque wrench, store it with the batteries out of it, because what a shame if a 5-cent battery were to leak and ruin your $650 tool. All right, so we're just going to set this to 30 foot-pounds for the first round. And like I said, we're going to start with the center two And then we'll do an X pattern. We're up to 60 foot-pounds now. It's also worth mentioning, if at any point while the cams are out, the motor were to get flipped over, all of these buckets that are in here would fall out, and that's really bad because they are shimmed. They have different heights. So you definitely don't want to let the head flip upside down while the cams are out of it, or else you're going to be adding a whole lot of labor to your job. Okay, now we're going to go up to 90 foot-pounds. Ooh, almost made it. When we do our really big horsepower builds, we torque the heads all the way down to 150. And getting the stand to stay straight can be a challenge sometimes. Spam risk calling me. Okay, like I said, I normally go an extra 5 foot-pounds on the center 2 bolts just because they have a little bit more load than the outers. It's worked for me thus far. Now we have to put the heads back together, and before I do that, I'm going to get just a little bit of assembly lube here. You can find this stuff at any parts store. It's a brand, doesn't really matter. If I remember right, this is like Redline or something like that. And we're just going to spray a little bit of assembly lube onto each of the buckets and to all of the cam journals. We'll take our camshaft, and they are different. You'll notice on these W25 heads for a 2015 or a 2008 plus STI, there's a cam pickup right here on the back. So we're going to leave that in there next to the cam sensor. And this other one does not have a cam pickup on it, so we're going to leave that on the bottom exhaust gear. We'll take our caps. These also get torqued down, so you don't need, and really with my smaller 3/8 wrench that I use, you could do this entire job with just that. Because the smaller ones, the 3/8 ones, go up to 100 foot-pounds. I'm just gonna get these snug. Right here, there's a little lip right there, and this groove on the cam seal here. All you got to do is just push that in to where it sits in that groove like that. After you do that, it's good to go. You can grab a seal driver tool. That will make things a little bit easier, but I've never had an issue doing it like this. Okay, those are both in. Now we're going to bolt the cam cover and cam cap back on. Before we go back installing the cam caps, this section at least, we have to apply a little bit of silicone sealer around the outer edges here because this part is exposed to the air, so we want to keep that oil inside. We're just going to do a really light film right along here. This is tough to do while I'm standing one-handed. I'll go through and smooth this out with my finger later on.
One more, sorry.
So this groove right here on the cap, that supplies and returns oils from the AVCS gears. So you just want to make sure that that stays nice and clean. I'm just going to even out this layer of silicone with my finger, wipe off the excess. So now we'll take this and just lay it right on top, just like that. And we'll get our fasteners. The bigger bolts on the midsection here, we're going to torque those down to 15 foot-pounds. And the outer ones, we're just going to go to 8. Just barely any torque at all. Okay, so we got this set to 15 foot-pounds. There's no real important order here. Just going to want to make sure that all these fasteners are torqued down correctly. And all these torque specs translate directly over to any sort of EJ257, 253 that you have, 20X, 207, 209, all those, 205, they're all the exact same. Okay, we got all those down to 15. We're going to go to 8 on these little ones. Okay. All right, that's the first major step. The cylinder head is now bolted down. It's good to go. You don't have to remove it, retorque it, none of that. The last thing we'll have to do is put the valve cover on, but we'll do that after we get the other cylinder head on. Everything from the previous side is exactly the same. The torque sequences are all exactly the same. The torque values, everything. It also should be worth mentioning, we are doing a build on a stock motor with out front refreshed heads. An out front built block will come exactly packaged like the OE will. It'll have all of the caps and bungs and everything, the plate on the rear main seal, everything will be ready. It'll be just like this. Some other manufacturers, like IAG, they leave some other things like these bolt holes here to put the wrist pins in. Those aren't there. The rear plate isn't on, so those are some things that you'll have to factor in when you buy that engine. But if you're buying it from out front, like we do, everything comes assembled, ready to go. So let's say you bought a out front engine package, this video is going to be exactly for you. All right, while we're at this point, we're going to throw our spark plugs in. I have these gapped down to 0.25. For the amount of power that this car is going to be making, that's plenty fine. If it goes up to like 700 horsepower, I'd recommend ARC coil packs and gapping them down to like 0.20. Now that we got those on, we're going to move on to the oil pan and getting that set up. This customer has optioned for a Killer Bee pickup and Killer Bee baffle. We usually use those standard in every rebuild. All right, this O-ring right here that comes with your Killer Bee pickup, this is the $7,000 O-ring. If you don't put that on and you start your engine, you'll be right back to where you are right now. So always make sure that you have that O-ring on there, and then that just goes right here into the oil pickup hole. For these two longer bolts right here, I like to put just a little bit of Loctite on them, just for some added security. One of the main reasons we always use Killer Bee for these oiling components is they have an absolutely fantastic reputation for almost no failures. I've never seen one fail. And the biggest reason is the factory pickup, it only has one support stand right here. And the flux, it's not actually welded, it's not stainless like this. It's just fluxed together like something you'd see with really tinny parts and small, thin parts. And over time, since there's only one support bracket, it vibrates. And you'll get fractures right here along the pickup surface. And it'll lead to a loss of oil pressure. And you definitely do not want that. So we always use the Killer Bee ones with every single one of our builds. No, I just need parts more. This is all finished. That's on there tight. Everything's on there good. O-rings in. Those bolts are Loctited. Now we're going to silicone this surface right here and slap our brand new oil pan on. That's another thing that people often miss. They'll try to reuse the oil pan by cleaning it out if they spin a bearing or something like that. The oil pan itself is pretty cheap, and for that reason we just buy new ones and put them on, because for the amount of time it would take us to clean it up, we might as well just buy a new one. And with a new one, you know it's guaranteed not to have any metal flakes in any of the baffling or the passages that's in the pan itself. Okay, got a nice thick bead of silicone there. We'll just, again, take our finger and just spread it out nice and evenly. There's still a lot extra on there. This is entirely too much silicone I put on here, but oh well, just got to clean it up. Make sure you get it all off. Got our brand new OEM pan here. We'll get that installed. There's also an O-ring here for the oil return. Not as imperative, but you definitely want to have that on there. And we'll just start all these bolts. Using fresh hardware, there's absolutely nothing wrong with reusing the old stuff. Our parts cleaner's down at the moment, and I wanted to get this motor put together, so I'm using some fresh hardware. All right, you ready? Now we are going to do the oil pump. We're going to get that installed. Again, we're using a brand new OE STI 12mm pump. You can try to clean out and rebuild the pumps if you want. Again, the way we see it, it's definitely way easier, and you get the added insurance of knowing that there's no debris or contaminants in the oil pump by just using a brand new one. Well, like I said, so you can service these pumps. You can take these bolts off right here, pull this apart, take these Allen keys out, and you can take everything out, clean it all out the best you can, but there's still that 1% chance that you'll have bearing material. And all it takes is just a little bit to put you right back to where you were now. Okay, in your gasket kit, you're gonna have a very funky looking O-ring, and it's got a little rib on it. It's just that guy right there. There's a couple of them, so don't be alarmed if you see more than one. But we're going to use one of these and put it right on the front of the engine, right where the oil pump goes. You also have to apply silicone to this. So I'm going to do everything I can to not be sloppy like I was on the oil pan with this. I try to do a really good job, but I mean, sometimes it's just not in the cards. I just got to clean it up with my finger afterwards. As long as you be sure that there's a whole bunch of extra that's going to possibly go into the passages and stuff, you'll be okay. Now, when you're putting this on, the oil pump has these two flat spots that key on to the crankshaft here. So you just want to make sure that your pump's oriented correctly so that it'll slide on. We're almost there. Now we're just on the stud. There we go. Okay. And I'm going to tap this on very lightly. All right, we're going to get all these oil pump bolts in here. Make sure that they get fastened down so that we have good sealing and no leaks and good oil pressure. And then as soon as we get all these bolted down, we're going to install the crankshaft seal. Okay. And these do not need to be very tight. I'm just using a really short 1/4-inch ratchet and just getting them snug. Now we will put the crankshaft seal on. Once again, go back to our handy dandy bag here, and that's this guy right here. I'm sure there is a seal driving tool available online, but if you work on Subarus long enough and you have to remove an axle, you'll need a 32mm socket. And a 32mm socket actually just so happens to fit right over it. All right, that's nice and flat. Give that one once more. Just as long as that's nice and flat, you should be set. Next up, I don't have a water pump here yet. It's in the mail. It'll be here tomorrow. So we're going to hold off on the timing system for now. But what we can do is start getting all of our water lines, heater lines, our manifolds, valve covers, all that stuff set. That way when the timing components show up tomorrow, we can slap it on, time it, and then we should be somewhat ready to go. So I have this car's old hardware right here. So let's just pick out what we can use right away. Okay. And if you're new to Subarus, I wouldn't necessarily suggest storing your bolts like this. Maybe get an organizer, but when you've done a bunch of these, you can just throw them in a coffee can or a bag and have a pretty good idea about what goes where. We are going to need one of these big aluminum washers here, which is a crush washer. This is the coolant port that goes from the block. It's crusty. It's dirty. So this is going to go in this hole right here. It does have a crush washer, but I like to spray just a little bit of silicone right on the threads, real thin amount, nothing crazy. Just like a thin layer, just like that, just to make sure this thing doesn't leak, because that would not be very fun to replace once it's in the car. If you have a WRX or a model without an oil cooler, you will not have one of those. Speaking of oil cooler, we also have a brand new OEM one of those as well. If you're seeing a trend, every single component that has oil going through it, if you have a spun bearing, which if you're watching this video, that's more than likely what happened. If you have a vehicle that spun a bearing, you definitely want to make sure that you clean or replace every single component that had oil flowing through it, because if it doesn't get cleaned out, you'll just be sending dirty oil right back through your brand new engine, and you'll be right back to where you were right now in about 2 months. Get this hose. This hose for this oil cooler has a really weird design to it, because it has these weird hose clamps that have like heat shields on them. I've never seen any other manufacturer use something like this, but I mean, it works. So we'll go ahead and slide that on there before we put the oil cooler on, because then we can get to the bottom side. Maybe. There it goes. Okay. Okay. Okay, that's done. We'll grab an oil filter for that later. Next, let's do our sensors like we had talked before. Okay, so since the motor's already upside down, we'll just throw the bottom side cam sensors on. If you look, it's really hard to tell in video, but these cam sensors are side biased because the bolt holes are just slightly different. So see how it's a little off, but this one should line up correctly. Okay, we got the bottom cam sensors. Get the top side. We'll get the cam sensors, the crankshaft sensor, as well as the knock sensor put on as well. This guy here. Get those on there. Okay, there's our crank position sensor and our rear cam position sensors. Now we will grab the knock sensor. Get that bolted down. As of late, Out Front has started shipping back the vent plates to the cylinder heads in these little baggies. So you want to make sure that those get put back on correctly. Okay. Now before we continue, there's something extremely important that you need to be mindful of when you're putting one of these engines together, and that is your oil lines. More specifically, this one over here. Because I've only done it once, and it's such a pain in the neck to do if you forget, that I promise you, you also will only forget it once. This oil line right here, it's very small, it's very easy to forget. It just goes from this part of the head up here to this part of the head. And what sucks about this oil line in particular, is if you forget it and you put on your water pump, your hoses, timing cover, gears, all that stuff, there is no possible way to get the fastener in with all that stuff put on. So you'll be about 90% of the way finished with your build, and then you'll look down and you'll see, oh, I wonder where this goes. And then you have to take everything apart. You have to take your timing apart, your water lines, all this stuff, the cover for your timing cover, all that stuff has to come off. So, word to the wise, don't forget this thing. And another thing worth noting, these banjo bolts for your AVCS, they have these filters in them from the factory. Remove them. Just take them out, take a 90-degree angle pick, and take them out because they're not going to help filter oil out. All it's going to do is starve oil pressure to your AVCS gears, and it's going to take them out. So just take the filters out, let the oil filter do its job. In your gasket kit, you will also receive copious amounts of copper washers. So definitely going to want to throw fresh copper washers on these things. So one on the top, one on the bottom, just like any other banjo bolt. Get those on nice and tight. This is the time that organizing all your fasteners would be better. Where you're not digging for them. Where'd I put my socket? Okay, that one's on. Now let's do, can do our dipstick. The dipstick also comes with fresh O-rings in the gasket kit, so we'll take these old dipstick O-rings off. Put those on there. Hi, Zena. So we'll take our two valve covers here. We'll put the spark plug tube gaskets in. And then the valve covers themselves are side specific. So you want to make sure that you have the right one. And if it's not seeming to fit correctly, it's because you have the wrong side. We got our fresh, clean valve covers with the new OE valve cover gaskets and the new spark plug gaskets. We do still have to silicone though. So we're gonna bust out our silicone gun one more time. Okay, so the important places to be sure that you get a good amount of silicone are in these corners right here. That's where it's most prone to leaking. That and along the bottom side here. To be honest, you probably don't need silicone the full 360. I always do just to be safe anyway though. So we'll take this here, put a nice little blob right there, and we'll just start going up and around. Same thing as before, I'm just gonna smooth it over with my finger. Make sure that we got a nice even layer of RTV. If you have a GD chassis STI, your cylinder heads are going to have these things called half moons, and they're just going to be these billet half circles that sit right behind the cams. From the factory, they're plastic. If you need new ones, you can get billet ones off of our website. They're from Outfront, or you can call Outfront and get them. But they are available on our website. The later model year ones like these cylinder heads don't use them. I'll just go right like that. We'll get our fasteners on. Like that. And actually, if I'm doing a motor that I know is going to take me a couple days minimum, I like to get all the RTV parts done the first day. That way I know day two, if day two goes really, really well and I can actually get the car or engine in the car, then I'm safe to start it because all of my silicone sat up overnight, you know. Okay, now let's do the other valve cover. My tip was cut at a really bad spot, so you can see how you just have a really nice thin film. That's all you need, especially for these valve covers. Having any silicone on them at all will help. It does come with silicone from the factory though. A lot of people get confused because there's a rubber O-ring around it. They don't think that you need silicone, but yeah, you need to have some sort of RTV or sealer around these parts. These valve cover bolts are extremely easy to strip out. So if you're using an electric ratchet like I am, always finish them off by hand. Now that's finished. Let's go ahead and throw this on while we're at it, since it caught my eye. This is the turbo water return. It has a banjo bolt, just like the oil feed and return from the AVCS. So we'll get this out, put a fresh set of copper washers on it, and get it bolted on. And that actually goes on the other side. So we'll flip this around again. It has a little tab here to put an assist bolt in. So we'll get those set there. And then you'll notice this elbow, the turbo oil drain, is kind of tilted out of the way. That's just so that out front can package it with the deck surface being flat. All you got to do is take a rubber mallet, tap that into position. Get that bolted down, and we'll get a small 10mm bolt for this right here. Okay, and while we're at it, let's go ahead and throw the coil packs on. This guy's using the OE coil packs. Before I put either aftermarket or OE coil packs in, I always just shoot them with just a little bit of dielectric, just to be sure that they get nice clean contact. Okay, we got those fastened down. Flip it over and get the other side. Okay, so like I said, this guy optioned just the OE coil packs, trying to save a little bit of money. But if you're in the market for some aftermarket coil packs, we actually manufacture our own. These have a higher spark output, so you can run a larger plug gap with higher horsepower applications. The reason that's important is because when you close the plug gap a lot to prevent spark blow out, you can run into random misfires and some odd roughness counts on your AP, and just overall just a poor drivability. Whereas if you put a higher output spark coil with a larger plug gap, say like an 020, you can make all the way into 1,000 horsepower without having weird idle and partial throttle issues. So if you're in the market for some coil packs, you've been having some spark blowout issues, definitely check out our coil packs. Okay, so we have our AVCS solenoids here. I actuated them and made sure that they run great. We're going to slide those into the housings here, and then they just have a little keeper bolt to make sure they don't slide out. Let's flip it back upside down. Since the majority of the intake side stuff all goes on after the water pump's on, we're going to go ahead and throw the manifold and the turbo system on. So with that, we will need a fresh set of exhaust manifold gaskets, which also come in your gasket kit. I'm telling you, like, a lot of people will think they're saving a couple extra bucks not getting the OE gasket kit. All you're saving is really nothing, because everything you save you're going to spend in gas going back and forth to the parts store, grabbing stuff that you didn't know that you needed. Very strange on this AVCS block, only this block. It's the only Subaru fastener I know that is this long and doesn't have a shoulder on it. So definitely do not use or lose these bolts for whatever reason. They are specific to this part, and I haven't seen them exist anywhere else in an STI or a WRX or anything like that. Same thing over here. Okay, now we can put the manifold on. After the manifold's on, you can bolt on your up pipe, and then I usually, depending on how you took your car apart, I always keep the whole up pipe and turbo all assembled together. That's another hot tip. If you're taking these cars apart, try to do it in the biggest chunks as possible. You'll see later on, the intake manifold as well is completely assembled. The TGVs are still on, the harness is still on, the injectors are still in. That just makes things a lot easier when you're going on reassembly. You just take the entire assembly of the intake manifold and slap it on, rather than have to do all the individual little pieces. That's on. Now we will take this and tilt it upright like so. Now we have the entire turbo system here. But in order to set this on, really what I do is I just guide the turbo onto the turbo drain. If you can do that, it should just go right on. Like that. Okay. All right, I gotta go grab a 2-bolt up pipe gasket. That is one thing that the gasket kit does not come with. It does not come with a down pipe gasket or an up pipe gasket, so you'll have to source those on your own. Okay, for these up pipe gaskets, we like to use the Grimspeed ones. They have a nice thick amount of layers, so you know it won't start leaking on you. Good idea for anytime you're working on a car, let alone doing a Subaru. If you put a fastener on, tighten it, just right away. Because that keeps you from forgetting about it later. Obviously, I know that I told you to just leave these two loose until we tighten the top ones, but just keep in mind, like whatever component you're doing, I know that this turbo right here has 4 fasteners to fasten it to the actual engine, and that's 2 on top and 2 on the bottom. So just keep that in mind. When you get everything started, you can throw all your fasteners on and then go back and finish all of them. That mount bolt, get this mount bolt. And these are just the turbo support brackets that I'm bolting down here. Definitely going to want to make sure you have these. Only instance you shouldn't have these is if you have a rotated setup. If you do not have a rotated setup, you absolutely should have your turbo support bolts and brackets, because if you don't, the flex joint that is inside of this up pipe will eventually break and you'll have an up pipe leak. So definitely want to make sure you have those brackets. Okay. So we got the turbo drain fastened. Now we need to get the turbo feed on and tight. That's just these two right here. Here, I'll move Richard. Get it out to the light a little bit more. Okay. Is that good? Okay. So we just got to get this guy tight right here. Appears that it's bent just a little bit, so we just got to bend it back a little bit. All right. You'll need 2 17mm wrenches to tighten this down. Definitely want to use the second wrench, because if you bend this line too much, it'll crack. Come on. All right. A good stopping point anyway. I just realized on the back of the block here that there is a oil passage here without a plug in it. So I'm going to have to find the plug and get that done. Yeah, this won't mean anything for you guys, but we're going to start back up on this tomorrow. All right, so we're back. It's the next day. We're probably about a third of the way through the process here. Just to recap, we have both cylinder heads bolted and torqued down with the ARP studs. We have the oil pickup and baffle installed with the fresh oil pan, a fresh oil pump, new oil cooler. The turbocharger is on. And it's time to start putting the timing assembly together, the water pump, and the hoses. So let's do the water pump. Okay, so we have our water pump here with a fresh water pump gasket that's also included in the gasket kit. And these water pump bolts are extremely easy to strip out. So you definitely want to be careful when you're tightening them down. Don't get too overzealous with your wrench or your socket, whichever one you're using. Just get all these started and then tighten them down with a power tool. So before we put our timing covers on, we have to put this water transfer tube on. And with that, we also have to put on our water pump crossover O-rings. So those are just a big, fat, chunky O-ring. It's about the size of a 50-cent piece. We're just going to slide those in right here onto the top of the block. There's one on each side. Then you kind of have to throw all this stuff together as one assembly. You're also going to encounter, if you're using the factory clamps, you're going to encounter these. It's called a clicker clamp, and I like using these because they're super low profile and they never come loose. The only downside to these is you have to have a special tool to get them tightened. So this one's from Matco. The part number is a CP9406, and basically it allows you to both loosen or release and tighten them together. So sort of, it doesn't really work that well when there's no tension on it, but it just sort of slips in that groove there. But we're going to use these on both the valve cover breathers and the crankcase breather here. So we're going to slide that over. But before we do all that, we have to kind of situate this setup. Hello? Somewhat working?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. So we had a little bit of technical difficulty there, but I just bolted on the water pump with a fresh gasket, and then we got this crossover tube with the PCV block and the coolant crossover pipe on. There's 4 bolts that hold this crossover on. There's 2 O-rings underneath it. The bolts are somewhat long, and they have a little nipple on the end. That's how you can dignify them from the other bolts. And they absolutely will strip if you over torque them or use the longer bolts. So definitely be careful with that. And then we fasten down this breather 90-degree bend here with a clicker clamp. It's very hard to get to if you don't have the tool, but you can use like a worm drive clamp if that's all you have. We're actually going to end up using a worm drive clamp on the main PCV breather here because it is virtually impossible to get a clicker clamp down in here at this point of the build. So I'm going to get this old zip tie off of here. And then we're going to get a worm drive clamp and get this thing installed. Grabbed a fresh worm drive clamp. It makes things way easier to get this thing installed because getting a clicker clamp tool down on this main PCV is really freaking tricky. So we're gonna get this down on there. All right. Then it'll just be an 8mm to get that worm drive clamp nice and tight. Make sure that this thing's facing the right way when you install it. The PCV tube that goes back to the manifold needs to be facing forward. This one has been cut because he's using an aftermarket AOS, but this will normally go back to the turbo inlet. All right, now that we have the water pump and water distribution set up, we do have one more pipe to add here that we can do a little bit later, but we are going to start, you know what, actually let's do that right now. Just because the timing covers can get in the way. So we have these 2 right here, and this is just a little transfer pipe that goes from the oil cooler to the block. Get this set up here. And that's just going to chill underneath here, like so. Okay, now that's on. And it just has a little tie-down bolt here on the front of the oil cooler, or oil pump, my bad. And now, while the motor's upside down, we'll go ahead and throw the engine mounts on as well. Okay, so now we're just gonna bolt down the engine mount. The engine mount bolts have a lock washer on them with no flange on the head. So definitely want to be sure that you use the right hardware on these, because I'm sure that Subaru sent them out the door with a lock washer for a reason. Fumble in the bag this morning, Richard. Okay. Engine mounts are now on. Now really all we need for the rest of the bottom side of the engine is an oil filter, but we'll put that on at the end. Now we can get this thing back upright because we are going to start the timing. So first things first, you're going to want your timing covers for the rear. These are important to have because they have guides on them. So if you do not have these guides on your STI, there's a problem and you need to get a new cover or guides, whichever one it is. But you have to have those guides. Not having them, you're running the risk of skipping timing or tossing the belt, a bunch of other things that you definitely do not want to do. And the timing covers also have a specific fastener to them as well. It's a 10 millimeter head with a very, very large washer or a flange on it, just to distribute that pressure down on the plastic. If you put a standard one on, they can crack. So definitely want to use the right hardware on these. Okay, I think I got all of them now. So these are just going to go up here by the cams, as well as on these inner parts as well. And if your covers are missing these little brass collars with the rubber isolators on them, the gasket kit also has those. But these ones look like they're in just fine shape. Now we need the tensioner bracket and the hardware for it. Okay. We'll get this tensioner bracket on and torque down. This is also going to hold the last fastener for this timing cover over here. This has a humongous shoulder on it as to not crack the plastic once again, so we'll set that right in there. All right, all those are on now. Anyway, these timing kits come from Outfront. They come with a new OEM belt and all new OEM pulleys. Now when you order these kits from our website, you need to be sure to specify which water pump you need, because the water pumps are different depending on whether you have a oil cooler or not. So we get all of our pulleys out here. So with these timing kits, you get 2 smooth idlers and then 1 ribbed one. Your first smooth guy here is going to go right here. And when you're installing these idlers, you want to definitely be sure you're not cross-threading them, because the threads are built into the block And you definitely do not want to screw up the threads on them, because then you're going to have to take everything apart and tap the block, and you don't want to be partaking in anything like that. Second smooth one goes right below the first one, and then the ribbed pulley goes over here by the water pump. And your last pulley is this small one. These are really easy to forget, but they use a really long 12mm bolt, and that goes right over here. Okay, all of our pulleys are on and tight now. Gears on. Okay, now we are going to put the ABCS gears on. This is a very, very important part that some people overlook when they're rebuilding their spun bearing cars. Since these are actuated by oil, they have bearing material in them if your car spun a bearing previously. So you have two options. You can either buy new ones from the dealership, which is fine, but if you don't want to spend the extra money and you're okay with a little bit more downtime, you can send these with your engine to Outfront Motorsports, and they will service them, take them apart, put fresh seals in, and then they have a fixture that actuates them as well. So this is a 4-bolt face, lower exhaust side. So we're going to go here. You'll see on the inside of the gear here, there's a bunch of holes, but one of them right there is the important one, because this is what locates the gear onto the cam itself. It is definitely possible to put this on incorrectly and shove a bunch of torque at it and shove that locating pin into one of the oiling holes. Don't want to do that. So just kind of get this to a position where you're familiar with. So the pin is facing at 12 o'clock. I'll get this hole somewhat at 12 o'clock. Just kind of slide it on there. All right, and you can see it's seated all the way down, and you can tell it's right if you try to twist the gear, and you can feel it pushing against the valve springs. That's how you know that it's installed correctly. So we're going to do that to all 4 of these. Nope, so each one is stamped with its position. So this one right here says intake left hand. So if you're confused on which one's left and right, the head actually has it stamped right here on the top. So this is the left hand and this is on the intake side. So I know that this gear goes right here. And even the plastic gears that you'll find on an EJ20 or a pre-08 STI, those ones have their positions etched into them as well. Okay, so now we need to get all of our AVCS bolts. These need to be somewhat clean. They do have an oil hole going through them. That's what supplies and returns oil. And they have a 10 Allen head. And that's going to be very important because earlier on in the video I talked about that timing gear tool. And if you are still using the factory bolts here, some people like to switch them out for a hex head. I don't like to do that because then you can't use the special tool. So as long as you still have the tool, this will be extremely easy for you. A lot of people tend to overthink this process. But we are still going to need our torque wrench because you have to torque these bolts down, and I'll show you how to do that as well. And you're going to set your torque wrench to 70 foot-pounds. And I also like to use a regular old 3/8 extension when I do this. So you're going to take your 3/8 extension, just going to slide it right into the crankshaft there. Then, with your cam gear tool, This is going to spline into the inner part of the cam gear here, set to 70 foot-pounds. I'm using this 3/8 extension here to hold the cam gear tool so that I don't have to try to use two hands. Just makes things a little bit more consistent. So what I like to do with my free hand instead is hold this gear tool so it doesn't slide out, and you just push it straight down. That one's torqued. Do the same thing on the bottom here. All right, dip it down below our extension. All right. Come on. Go. All right. All of our cam gears are torqued down now. Take this back out. Now we can get the crankshaft sprocket and start laying our timing belt on. And I put that crankshaft sprocket in a very special spot that I definitely remember. I had this set in the car because big important thing you want to watch when you're storing your parts while you're waiting for your engine to get back is what you should throw in a box and what you shouldn't. This is one of the things I never throw in a pile because all these itty bitty little pickups can get bent or chipped or broken off, and you'll have to buy a new one if you do that. So anyway, this is our crank gear sprocket. We're going to slide that on right there. And this is also extremely important to have. It's our main timing guide. And we'll slide that right over the gear. Okay. So the nice part about using an OEM timing belt is it has cheater marks on it. So you don't have to worry about the actual gear position. Well, obviously you do, but it has lines on it to show you where everything goes. So you're going to start with your dotted line here. That's going to go onto the 12 o'clock position of the crankshaft gear. And there's a little notch cut in it. There's an arrow and a square notch. You're going to go to the square notch first. We're going to wrap this around like this. These two gears over here, they're going to be free floating. So you're going to lay that one on there. And once again, it has a notch with the line in the belt. So here's the notch. There's two different sets of notches. There's a single, which you'll line your belt up mark with, or your belt mark up with. And there's a lower one that has two, and they're normally painted green. Those two are going to line up to each other. So an important note for this, when you're timing this engine, you're basically going to start here and work counterclockwise all the way around. While you're doing that, you need to be sure that you're keeping as much tension on the belt as possible, because when you get to the end, this little section right here, you're going to want as much slack as possible to be able to slide the tensioner in. So we're going to get this nice and tight, and then we'll line up our other timing mark here, and you'll want to be sure to slip it into the guide as well while you're going. So we got that. This is going to go over top of the smooth idler. I like to just lay it up like that. And this wraps around the cog gear and goes over the water pump. And now we're at this position here. This is where you're going to want that special tool. So, with this special tool, you'll need a 17mm wrench and a 19mm wrench. Okay. So you're going to want to start with your tool being a little bit loose. You're going to set this. These have these 10 Allen hex on the inside, and they're magnetic as well. So it's a really, really slick tool, and it makes this job extremely easy. Then you're going to take your 19 millimeter, and you're going to find your line. Now the line's kind of tough for you to see, but it's right here. And you're just going to get this mark lined up to the line, like so. Then what you're going to want to do, you're going to want to pull this belt as tight as you can without moving the actual belt itself on the other gears, if that makes sense. So, if you can tell, we got a nice amount of tension here. Once we got that set, then we're just going to tighten this bolt down on the front, and it's going to lock that gear in place. So it won't move. But you do have to keep your finger on the belt or else it'll slide off. Now, same thing. Grab your 19 millimeter wrench, and you're just going to let the belt skip on this gear until you get it to where this white mark on top is lined up. And then once again, soak up that extra slack. Now you can move your finger, get that nice and tight, and tighten down your 17 millimeter. Then what I like to do is just kind of take the open end of the wrench and just set it in that hole right there. That way it keeps the belt in its current position. Now we'll grab our new OEM tensioner. The tensioner has this release pin. You're definitely going to want to make sure that it's in its safe home position where it's sticking all the way through the actual tensioner body. And the other thing is you have this spacer washer here and an O-ring on the backside. The only important part of the O-ring is to keep this whole assembly together so it doesn't fall apart. And you can leave the O-ring on because there's actually a groove cut in the tensioner bracket to, make space for it. So if we did the job right, we should have a little bit of tension all the way around here, giving us as much slack right here as possible. What you're going to do is you're going to set the tensioner in kind of sideways first, but then you want to straighten it up and just work this bolt in by hand first. You can tell you're lined up because there's a steel pin pressed into the tensioner bracket right here, and that's what the actual tensioner is going to push on. So I got that ran in by hand. Go ahead and jockey the belt a little bit. It's going in smooth, so now I'm going to hit it with my electric ratchet and send it home. Ooh. And give it a nice torque. All right. That's how you time an EJ. It's that simple. The last thing you have to do is you need to grab your timing shim. Now these come with the Gates kits. I tend to keep them because I like having them on hand. But this is a Gates brand one. And all you do with this is you just slide it between the guide and the belt itself. And the thickness of that plastic shim is the tolerance that you need for the belt to the guide. So all I do is start on the left side, because as the fastener tightens, it's going to push it down this way. Just give it a little bit of tension, push down on the shim. Tighten those down. And then you can pull the shim out. Simple as that. And then we need to go around and do that with all of the timing guides. There's 3 of them, 3 other ones in total. There's one here, and one on the other side as well. And the other ones actually use an Allen key. So we're going to loosen that just a little bit. You see it pop up there. We'll push that back down. Tighten it. And pull it out. Try to get a good view here. Got it? All right. Now your timing's set. Hey, Dustin. Dustin, hey, come here. Our policy here at the shop is to always have a second set of eyes verify the timing, so Dustin's gonna do that for me now. Try to get a good view here. Got it? All right. Now your timing's set. Hey, Dustin. Dustin, hey, come here. Our policy here at the shop is to always have a second set of eyes verify the timing, so Dustin's gonna do that for me now. Gucci? Thank you, Dustin. And then with all that being said, you can take your pin here, pull that on the tensioner. You'll see that soak up all that extra slack. And then we can remove the actual timing tool. So just crack these loose here, and then it should just slide right out. So all of your AVCS gears have these cover plates. The exhaust ones are big round ones with 4 bolts. The intake ones are these smaller 3-bolt ones. And they all have seals as well. The intake side is just a smaller diameter O-ring. And the exhaust side are these big fat ones, and for whatever reason Subaru ships them in their own packaging inside of the gasket kit. I don't know why they do that, but makes things easy to find. Those just lay in there. If everything's clean, it should just set in there. You shouldn't have to hold it in with anything. All right. And then they use these itty bitty, I think they're like an M4 bolt with a lock washer on them. And they are a 8mm head or a Phillips head, depending on which one you want to use. I prefer using the 8mm. We'll get our cover plate, and what I like to do is I like to just dangle them from the top. There, now that one's set, and I can go around and just put the bolts in. It's easiest that way. Okay, we'll just take a ratchet, and definitely do not want to kill these. I would not use a power tool on these. Just going to want to go until it gets tight. They have a lock washer, it'll do its job, but these are such a small thread that it would be extremely easy to strip these out. So we'll get all these tight, and then we're going to put our timing covers on. And after we do that, we're free to put the intake manifold on. The intake manifold, if you took your car apart correctly, or at least the way that I do it, you shouldn't have to mess with the fuel lines or the harness or anything, because it should all be retained onto the... For the timing cover, they have these rubber seals on the back side. Once again, they're included in the gasket kit. So we'll go ahead and throw those on. And the fasteners for this center timing cover have a very large shoulder on them so that you don't crush the plastic, but you can still get them tight. So definitely be sure to try to keep the factory hardware for those, or else it'd be kind of tricky to get this cover tight without cracking it. We got our new seals on the top and bottom. Those don't seal out any oil or coolant or anything. It's more just like a dust cover. And here's one of those fasteners I was talking about. You can see it has a big, fat, chunky shoulder on it. And that's, again, just to keep it from crushing the plastic. Those are going to go all around the front cover and some on the bottom as well. Nice and quiet in here now. There's 3 of them on the bottom. 2 of them use the shouldered bolts like on the top, and the last one uses just a small, non-shouldered, but a big, big flange. Outside timing covers. Oh. All right, now we have our other timing covers that cover up the actual gears themselves. And they use a very long 10mm bolt. And although these are plastic, you would think that it wouldn't matter what you torque them to. The problem is they have a captured nut on the back side. And if you tighten them down too much, what will happen is that captured nut will get stuck and then it will break free. You can actually see it right here. It has this captured nut. If you over torque it, it'll spin in the plastic. And then what you end up having to do is cut the bolt off, and you'll have to replace the front and the rear timing covers. So just go very easy when you're tightening these down. I would just get them snug and then give them a quarter turn. Okay. That's all of the timing covers. I'm going to wipe them down because they're a little dirty. Wish our parts washer was working. Okay. Now, let's recap real quick. We have the entire timing assembly on. We have the water pump piping on, the coolant crossover, the PCV. All of the sensors for the cams are in. Let's go ahead and throw the oil fill on right quick, because that's an easy one. Nothing super special here, just these 3 bolts and the one shorter one for the support bracket. Okay, now it's time for the intake manifold. This is probably the most challenging part of this entire process. It looks super intimidating, but I promise you, if you let the fuel leak out on your stomach, it'll be just fine. No, this part, it is kind of intimidating, but it's really not hard. You just have to pay attention to what you're doing. But before we put that on, we are going to install these intake manifold gaskets. So let's get our overnight paper towels out. And these do lay one specific way, but they have little locating pins on them to help get them lined up. It's also nice that they put those on because it makes sure that the gasket itself won't slide around while you're installing the manifold. So the strategy here is going to be to kind of start it up this way and then lay it down on, because you have this coolant pipe here and this thing can kind of make things a little bit more. There we go. Okay, now we can set this thing on. Make sure that there's no harnesses on the faces of your TGVs there. We're just gonna lay this down like so. This worm clamp's trying to pop back off. Get our bypass valve in its correct spot. So the first thing I'm going to work on getting lined up here is the turbo inlet. You kind of have to tilt the motor or the manifold up a little bit to get it on. Definitely tricky to film. We're fighting something here. It's this. That's what we're fighting. So we're going to get that out of the way. There we go. Okay. Now, I like to use a hook tool here to get this started. Just kind of slip it in the backside like that and just kind of follow it around. And you'll kind of hear it seat. Just like that. We'll do it one more time just to make sure it's not caught or flipped or anything. All right, that's on. Now effectively the manifold's installed. We just have to bolt it down, and we're going to start by doing that turbo inlet, just because it's really easy to forget. We don't want to do that. So it's a 10mm head. And it's just a worm drive clamp, so just go really easy on it. And it actually looks like it slipped off a little bit there, so we're gonna loosen that back up and make sure that we get it on there all the way. Okay, now we'll get our intake manifold bolts here. And what I like to do is I like to just slip them down into the TGVs first. Get them all set in there, and then we'll start them all. And then after they're all started, then we'll tighten it all down. Oops. Once you put it on, it's not that bad. Okay, all these are started, so now I'm going to go around and tighten them all down. Yeah, the thing that I feel like people struggle with is when they separate like the upper and lower section of the manifold, because then you're having to take fuel lines out from underneath the manifold, and the harness has to come off, and it adds so much extra labor for really no reason. So unless you're installing, aftermarket TGVs or fuel rails or a fuel system or injectors or anything like that, it's for just a basic rebuild like this, there's absolutely zero reason to take the intake manifold apart. Just leave it all together. So now that the manifold's tightened down, we need to go around and connect everything because the harness was on it. So we'll start on this side. What we're going to start with is the lower cam sensor and the AVCS solenoid. So we'll just sneak this harness down through here. Kind of fighting me. There we go. Okay, and that's just going to plug in right here to this solenoid. Oh, whoops. There we go. Into that solenoid. Then we'll get our coil pack plugs. Upper AVCS plug here. And lastly, for this side is our cam sensor on the top side, right there. The nice part about doing it this way is if you're putting on a used harness, as long as you're not putting on a brand new harness, if you're putting on a used harness, everything tends to lay where its home position is. So even though I slapped the manifold on without the cam sensor hooked up, the plug was right next to it. So that makes things easier as well. The injectors are already plugged in. I'm going to rotate the engine around just a little bit. flop your bypass valve return over, and back here is the NOx sensor. Get that plugged in. And then we also need to get this PCV return back to the manifold. It can be really tricky to get on, but if you have a set of extended needle nose pliers, that makes it far, far more easy. Just slide this clamp down a little bit. Get this under here. Here, come grab this, because this is a part that people miss a lot. So this hose right here, this is your PCV return back to the manifold. So you're just going to put that right there onto that port. Okay, and then there is a clamp for it right here. So slide that around. Go. That just sets right up like that. Very, very common for people to forget that. So now we will get our coolant lines for the throttle body put on. If you're building your car yourself, you can definitely bypass these if you want to simplify the engine just a little bit and just tee them together. These aren't super necessary, but it does come like that from the factory, so if you're going for a full OEM rebuild, definitely just put those back on. Get our itty bitty screwdriver here. This one has a worm clamp on it from the previous owner. We're just gonna leave it on there. Okay, now this is all set. You should notice a pretty nice little void here in the harness and routing and all that stuff. That's just gonna sit right here. And actually I kind of screwed the bag here because this hose actually goes around the bypass valve return. So let's take this back off real quick. Okay, so we'll pull that hose out of the way, sneak that one in there. There we go, that's better. There's one thing Subarus are notorious for, it's how particular the order of things have to be done when you're putting the engine together. Case in point, remember that oil line I was talking about, that if you mess up, you have to like take the whole timing part, or timing back apart. Come over here, I'll show it to you. So if you forget this oil line for your upper AVCS, the actual bolt that goes into the block way down here, right there, there's absolutely no way to get that fastener in with this timing together. So absolutely don't forget that. Do not forget that bolt. All right, got our wobble socket here. I'm gonna sneak down in here, get this bolt started. Oh, engine's trying to steal my tools. So next we'll put on the crankshaft pulley, get that tightened down, and then we will install the stretch fit belt onto the air conditioning pump here, which does require a little bit of a special tool. I'm sure that you might be able to do it with a screwdriver and some intellect, but I use a special tool because it makes things a lot easier. So we will throw on our crankshaft pulley. This customer has a lightweight crankshaft pulley that's all aluminum. I don't like using these, but I already reached out to the customer and he wants to keep using it. I prefer an ATI pulley or a fluid dampener if you don't want to use the factory pulley, just because a solid pulley isn't necessarily the best for long-term abuse, but this guy likes the way it looks, so he's going to keep it on. Then to get these tight, I normally just impact it on. Just a little buzz like that should be all it takes. And next up, he also has one of these Grimspeed AOSs. So we'll get all of his hoses hooked up here. And you can absolutely do this in the engine bay with the motor installed, but I like to do things on the stand as much as I can, because then once the engine's actually in the car, you're only 30 or so minutes away from having it running. Let's put the clutch on, and then after that, looking at our parts pile, it's getting pretty thin. I think we'll be about ready to put this motor in the car. Rolling? So this customer has an aftermarket oil pressure sensor. The factory one is just a switch, and it goes right here in this location, just to the left of the crankshaft position sensor. But he's using an aftermarket gauge that uses a different thread pitch than the factory port has. So we're going to remove this, set it aside, and then we have this brass one that converts the inner threads to a 1/8 MPT, so we can use an aftermarket sensor. Okay, so here's the aftermarket oil pressure switch here. We'll get this threaded in. And cinch it down tight. So this will not be on the factory harness, obviously. It's going to go to a gauge that's already in the car. And so we'll hook this up later. Nope. Anytime you're using something with an NPT fitting, it's only going to leak if it's not tight enough. So you basically just have to get it just barely tight enough to where it's not leaking. Definitely don't want to kill the threads on those. Okay, now we are going to flip the engine around and get the clutch installed. Okay, let me dig the clutch out. If you pulled your engine out and you have the clutch sitting on your table like this, you're probably wondering how the heck to get this throwout bearing out, because they clip in. It's really, really easy. All you need is a big screwdriver, and all you're going to do is you're just going to push down on it, and then while you're pushing down, just slide the screwdriver in and just pry, and it'll come right out. That's it. That's all it takes. It's not hard. Okay, then we'll take our pressure plate, give it a nice inspection. This one looks clean. It's worn, but still has plenty of life left on it. You can see the rivets here on the actual friction disc have plenty of material on them, so we're not going to sell this guy a new clutch. This clutch is just fine. We'll take a towel, wipe off some of this old clutch material here. Don't need to worry about resurfacing it since we're still using the old friction disc. What we're going to do is we're going to grab our 8 flywheel bolts here. So before you install your flywheel, you're going to get just a little bit of red Loctite. And some people like to put the Loctite on the bolts. I prefer to put it in the holes itself, because then you're not having to jumble holding the flywheel, putting the Loctite on the bolt and then putting it in. So I just squirt just a little bit into the actual holes itself. And if it runs out a little bit, that's all right. We'll wipe up the excess. All that excess. Okay. Now we can take our flywheel. And thanks to this company 23 stand here, a little shameless plug on them, you can actually sneak the flywheel in, whereas with a normal engine stand, you cannot do that. So we have this on here. Let's get it squared up. There we go. Now it's sitting flat. Now we'll run all of our bolts in. And these will be the last thing that we'll have to use our torque wrench for, because we're going to torque these bolts down to 55 foot-pounds. Before I got this engine stand, you would always have to put the clutch on when the engine's on the cherry picker, and getting the engine to not sit there and swing while you're trying to put on this super heavy flywheel and torque it all down makes it kind of challenging. So if you're big into Subarus and you work on them a lot, definitely recommend getting one of these engine stands. Makes things a whole lot easier. Okay, we'll get our torque wrench here set to 55 foot-pounds. And then I'm just going to use a pry bar here to prevent the engine from spinning. Or, actually, I'll show you a really cool trick. if you take one of your pressure plate bolts and you put it into the flywheel, so if you can get a pressure plate bolt in here, just wedge it in there, it'll actually hold the crankshaft from moving. Then we can come in here with our flywheel and torque this guy down. And you're gonna just wanna go in a star pattern for this one, just like a wheel. And I like to go around in a circle afterwards and check them. Okay, that's done now. Each clutch kit you get should come with a alignment tool. They're normally just plastic. I have a sawed off input shaft out of a transmission that I like to use because I find that it's just a little bit more accurate. There's even a nice polished one too. So we'll get that set in there like that. And put that into the pilot bearing. And that should center the clutch. And then, last thing you want to check before you put your pressure plate on is you want to inspect this ring here, because this is what actually actuates the clutch, is it's all done through this little snap ring. If it's dinged up, bent, anything like that, go ahead and replace it. But this one's in good shape, so we'll continue on. Okay, I got it. I'm gonna have to do it like this. Okay, there we go. Now on these pressure plates, there is locating pins that will tell you if it's in the right position. I've got one right here, all the other bolt holes line up. There's another one right there. So I'm gonna go ahead and start one of these bolts. When you're tightening this down, also just gonna go in a star pattern. These bolts do not need a whole lot of torque. They have a lock nut on them. I think the actual torque spec from the factory is like 15 foot-pounds or something. So not a whole lot of torque going on with these. And you can definitely bust them off in the crankshaft, or in the flywheel, my bad. Okay, now that they're all tight, I'm just gonna give them just one last little snugging. Last one. Okay. If you did that all correctly, this should be flat, and this alignment tool should slide right out. Holy crap, dude. There we go. Just like that. Okay, now this thing's ready to go on the cherry picker and get it put in the car. Okay, last thing we're going to do here before we put it on the cherry picker is we're going to install the stretch fit portion of this belt. Having the special tool definitely makes this easier, but with enough flathead screwdrivers and a little bit of intuition, you can get it on without this special tool. Okay, so this process is kind of tricky to get your first time. The stretch fit tool has a belt guide right here to keep the belt staying on the compressor. And then it comes with a plastic guide and a keeper. What you're gonna do is get this set on here. And what I like to do is get this keeper, get that set there. Haven't done this in a while. Same thing. So you're going to kind of guide it onto the rear set of ribs on the pulley, and slide this keeper over the belt and the guide. And you're just going to slowly walk it on. And it fell off. These aftermarket pulleys aren't the greatest for this. Come on. Just like so. Again, it's definitely possible to do it without the tool, but as you can see, even with the tool, it's still kind of tricky. So definitely recommend grabbing one of those. Okay, now we can get the, okay, first things first, we're going to get a floor jack underneath the transmission to prop the transmission up a little bit. That way you can slide the engine onto the transmission without hitting the lower engine mounts. So, and another thing to check when you're doing a new engine install is there's two locating dowels on the engine, and sometimes they get stuck in the transmission, and you'll get all the way to where the motor's almost in, and you'll notice that you have two sets of dowels. So definitely want to make sure that you get those out. You can usually just hammer them right through the block or through the transmission, and we're going to do that here. Spray a little bit of penetrating oil on them just to make it a little bit easier. This is what I'm talking about here. So these dowels got stuck in the transmission, and if you look on our new engine, it already has a set. So we're just gonna tap those through like so. Get a grab a punch and get them the rest of the way out. There's one. Oops. There's the other. Okay, so like I said, we are going to be using a floor jack to jack up the transmission to allow for the engine studs on the engine mounts to slide into their holes. So what you're going to want to do for that is just get the floor jack under here, and you're going to want to position it so it's right on the diff drain of the transmission. It can be kind of tricky to get your first time, so don't get discouraged. But we're going to jack up the transmission like so. And you don't want to go too crazy because there is some harnesses and stuff that you can pinch. You don't want to do that. Second to last thing, need to remove our radiator. Set that down there. Remove this radiator, gives us a little bit extra room. We'll just set this here. Once you get that on, you'll grab your fork here, slide the throwout bearing into the fork, like so. And then this pin has a slot cut in it, and there is a pin right here. So you're just gonna slide that pin in with the slot being horizontal, and just guide that all the way in. Now your clutch fork operates perfectly. And there is a plug that goes on the transmission that holds the pin in. And the plug is absolutely 100% mandatory. You have to have it, because if that pin starts to back out, what you'll see happen is it will eventually break this part of the transmission right here, and then it'll break this piece. And if that happens, you have to take the entire transmission out and replace the entire bell housing. It's a really big job for a small mistake. So don't forget that cap. One other piece I forgot to install earlier. This is just an intercooler, a top mount intercooler bracket, but it also has this eyelet here that we're going to use as a jack point. So it just gets fastened on with two 12mm bolts. So we'll get that on. Then we can put this thing onto a cherry picker. There we go. Okay, so like I said, I'm just gonna slide these chains, or the bolt for these chains, right through that top mount intercooler bracket, through that eyelet, and then the front anchor point, we're gonna use the air conditioning compressor. All right, last thing before we actually start the process of putting the engine into the car. Every Subaru that I've ever worked on has a service position for the hood. So this one is included in that. If you notice, there's two bolt holes here and another set of bolt holes here. It's the same thing on the other side. You can unbolt the factory hood dampers from the upper position and put them onto the lower one, and it'll prop the hood up further so you can work on things a little bit easier. The GDs uses a hole that's over on the passenger side strut tower. You just pull the factory hood prop out and then put it into the hood first and then loop it into the strut tower. That raises the hood way up, makes things way easier to work on. All right, I'm just gonna spin this oil filter on here before we put it in the car. I got the Maestro here with me. Justin, you want to operate the jack for me?
So I just take this handle and I put it all the way like this.
Yeah, all the way, dude.
All
The whole way.
Yeah.
Yep, the whole way. You can go a little more, yeah. It's best just to go slow with this stuff. You don't want to get too overzealous and try to be too fast. Just take your time. If you ding that clutch retaining ring with the input shaft of the transmission, you'll hear this ting, 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 and then you have to take the whole clutch back apart. All right, stop there, Justin. Let's pull back a little bit. First thing you're going to want to aim for when you're putting this motor in, that's good there, Justin, is these bottom dowels. So you're going to try to get them into their homes. And then after you get that started, then you can actually raise the engine back up a little bit. Come forward just a hair, Justin. Okay. Ooh. There we go. All right, raise it back up just a hair, Justin. Raise it back up. Okay, hold there. Okay. Now that I got both of those started, I'm just gonna come around the front and I'm gonna grab onto the exhaust manifold and you just kind of wiggle it around. It's like I've done this a time or two, dude. No, maybe some homies won't be able to, but that's how you do it. Something that might make things a little bit easier, just to get it seated all the way, you can throw a socket on the crankshaft here. Just kind of rotate it a little bit, and that'll help get the transmission splined into the clutch. But this is all the way in. It's close enough. Once you get it about to this point, you can go ahead and start throwing some hardware in. A lift. Okay, got a fresh battery here. Okay, keep drawing these in. one's nice and tight. Basically all you're fighting here is the dowels that we were talking about earlier. And this is a starter bolt hole here, so it uses a longer one, but I'm gonna throw a shorter one in real quick. There we go. Then we can, I think I actually have a long bolt on the bottom there.
Figure out how to check for leaks. We're gonna have bad times if you can't do that.
Okay. Absolutely we are. Okay. Those are both in. I'm gonna grab the starter. But before we do the starter, we are going to put the slave cylinder in for the clutch. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this floor jack out. See the engine drop down a little bit. And then we can lower the hoist. And it may not sit in the engine mount holes right away. Sometimes you have to get a pry bar in and tap them into place. But sometimes you can just wiggle it back and forth and it'll fall in. I'm not gonna try to do that right now. So we'll get the slave cylinder in, and there's one very, very important noise you wanna listen for when you're putting this in. And it's going to be pushing the clutch fork towards the rear of the car and clicking the throwout bearing into the actual pressure plate. If you hear that noise, you're home free, you can continue on. If you don't hear that noise and you can't get the clutch fork to clip in, you're gonna wanna hear this noise right here. I'm gonna take this clutch fork, I'm gonna push it back. You hear that click? Sorta. Well, now it's locked in. So I can push this all the way back, compress it, and if I pull forward, it's not coming out. That means that if I walk into the car, now I can take this clutch pedal, I can actuate it. See how it's moving? That's how I know that the clutch is working properly. And now when we get back from lunch, we will hook up all of the fuel lines, the coolant lines, put the radiator back in, put the intercooler on, the power steering, all that stuff, and we'll still need a lift to get the downpipe in, but we'll have it 90% of the way finished. So let's clip to after lunch. All right, we're back from lunch. I'm going to get the cherry picker out of the way, and we will start hooking up some of the hoses and lines, fuel, coolant, whatnot. Also show you all of the grounding locations on the engine so that you can make sure that you have proper grounding. And yeah, we'll just get into it. I'm gonna start by getting all this cherry picker stuff out of the way. And the other two just go, one's also on the front and the other one goes in the back. I prefer to leave the power steering pumps on the car when I take the engine apart and take it out, just because I don't have to bleed the power steering system afterwards. So it takes a little bit of labor away. For this back bolt, definitely going to want a swivel socket. If you haven't invested in swivel sockets yet, highly recommend doing so. It makes things a lot easier to get in those hard to reach areas of a Subaru motor. Quick little tip for storing your alternator long term. In order to keep the hardware in place, I always just feed it backwards through the threaded portions. That way you don't lose it, because these alternator hardware pieces are specific to the alternator, so you won't see them laying around somewhere else in the engine. So I like to keep that stuff nice and organized. And before I put the alternator on, I'm going to find his oil pressure gauge wire, which is right here, and we're gonna get this hooked up. That's on, nice and tucked away. Stay away from everything. And putting these alternator bolts in can be kind of tricky sometimes. It has this steel collar on the alternator, and sometimes they fit, sometimes they don't. We'll see if we can get it to go in without having to hammer on it. This tab needs to face out so we can use it as pulley cover. This one's fighting me a little bit. What the hell's going on over there? Okay. And this piece here just sits on the back side of the alternator like this. It's just a nice little captured bolt, or captured nut, sorry. Just to make things a little easier going on. And I need my ratchet. So the alternator's bolted down and started. Got the V-belt here for the alternator and the power steering. Then we'll just tighten this down. That should be tight enough. All right. Now we can grab our alternator harness here. Plug in our AC pump, put that onto its tab. We'll get this nut and lock washer off of the alternator and get the alternator power wire back on. Just like we did earlier with our coil pack plug kit, if you have an alternator connector that has the tab broken, we also have replacement ones of those on our website. So if your alternator connector is broken, definitely go to our website and look for that. It's super easy to swap over. It's essentially the exact same process as the coil pack plug. It's very simple. Okay. Now let's kind of see what we got going on here. This guy doesn't have factory fuel lines, so we're gonna have to kind of figure out the way all this stuff goes. I don't know who decided to shove a hose onto this, but that's not correct. I'm gonna see if we have a hose fitting that'll fit that. Boom. Okay, that's a proper install for that. Before, someone had just shoved this hose onto here and put a clamp on it. And obviously it worked, but it's not the correct way to do things. So we're gonna swap this over to a serviceable end, how it should be. Try not to stab myself. Okay, there. That is how that should be. Okay, next up over here, we have a vacuum line for the boost gauge. We're gonna put that onto the factory fuel pressure reference port, because the factory fuel pressure reference is on one cylinder's runner. And what you'll find is when you look up a data log of your fuel pressure, if you're monitoring it, every time, it's crazy that you can monitor this, like this level of detail with an engine. As soon as the piston starts going down and the valve opens, you can see a slight fluctuation in the pressure from the manifold. So you'll have a constant fuel pressure, but if you up the resolution and zoom in, you'll see this little dip. And we don't want that. We want a nice smooth pressure reference. So we're gonna take the reference line that's over here and we're gonna put it onto a different vacuum source that's central to the manifold. And that's standard practice with everything that we do here. Very, very common for us to switch that over. Okay. That's already tight. We already got that. Let's throw the spring on the clutch here. Thank you. This is just a little helper spring here for the clutch fork. And now that we have the slave cylinder bolted down and we've double checked that the clutch operates normally, we're safe to put the starter in. So I'll grab the starter. We're gonna kind of sneak this starter in here like so. Like that. And before we start the bolt, there is a ground strap right here that goes onto the starter bolt. And you don't want to forget that because this is one of the main engine grounds. It's a very, very big wire. There we go. So we got that there. Go ahead and start those threads. Maybe. There we go. And we'll get the lower starter bolt on as well. Sneak this in here. Okay, that's on. All right, I'll cinch that one from the bottom later. Now we can get this nut off of the back of the starter solenoid. Okay. Get that lock washer back on. And get this nut. It's also important to note that when you're doing this, you should definitely have your battery disconnected because this is a live positive wire anytime the battery's hooked up. Starter's on. Next thing to attack while we're standing right here is the heater core lines. So these are really easy to get on. Just slip them onto these ports on the back of the head. Right there. And I usually put one clamp on and then do the other hose. Just because with them both on it can... There we go. Get that on there. I got this one right here. Okay, heater core lines are on. As far as over here, we have the fuel system hooked up. We have a vacuum reference here that we need to figure out what it goes to. That's kind of the fun part with working on cars that are modified. But sometimes you figure that stuff out the more the parts you go on. So we'll start by putting on this main engine bay plug. This has a little locking tab that you just lock down. It's on there, and there's a mount tab here for it too. Right here we have the front O2 sensor. We'll get that plugged in. All right, and then let's grab this bolt here. This is for our pitch stop mount. Get that put on. Okay, that's tight. Next thing over here is going to be our coolant expansion tank. These are super common to crack along these barbs right here on these nipples. If you ever have one of these crack, we have a really, really sweet billet one that we sell. This guy did an option for it, but if you want to church up the engine bay and repair something that's broken, our billet ones, we'll put the picture of them right here somewhere, Richard. And they look super sick. Definitely look into getting one of those if you want to spruce up the engine bay a little bit. So the goal of this expansion tank, if you've ever been curious as to why Subarus have them, since the turbocharger is coolant fed and it's up sitting physically higher than the radiator, you have to have something to be able to bleed that coolant off at a higher point. So that's kind of what these expansion tanks do. If you go to a rotated setup, that doesn't use a coolant-fed turbo, you can get rid of this expansion tank altogether if you don't want it in your engine bay. Before I go bolting it down, I'll make sure it fits. Yeah, that's the right one. Okay. Another nice thing we'll do after we get the radiator in and the cooling system all tied up, what we can do is we can throw a cooling system pressure checker on, and that will tell us if there's any leaks or something loose in the cooling system before we add a bunch of coolant to it. That way we don't have to clean up a big mess. Okay, now that's on. Let's put the radiator in. Sneak the radiator down into its home here. Try not to mess up any of the fins. All right, then we have our radiator tie downs. Let's get our upper radiator hose on. These factory clamps have this really cool feature where they have a little tab that holds them open. The problem is sometimes they don't want to not close. There it goes. Okay, that's on. Let's get these expansion tank hoses up here on. And lastly, for the radiator, we will put the thermostat in and the thermostat housing on. Let me go. All right, we're gonna grab the new thermostat gasket out of our gasket kit. Okay, we got our hardware here. This one's gonna be really tough to film because with the car being on the floor, it's way down low, tucked away, so just trust me, bro, it's getting put on. We've got the thermostat in the water pump right here. I'm gonna take the lower radiator hose, kind of line it up, and then we'll get one of these bolts started. That one's on. Now those are tight. So, if everything was done correctly so far for the cooling system, I'm gonna go grab my pressure checker and I'm gonna put the tester right here. And as long as everything's hooked up, it should hold pressure. Let me go grab it. It's from Snap-on. Most of my stuff's from Snap-on. But all this does is just puts a little adapter onto the radiator cap so you can force pressure into it. These things are awesome for finding leaks, so you don't have to get the car hot to find a leak. But it's even better to leak check the system before you put coolant in it, because A, you're not wasting coolant, B, it's a whole lot cleaner. So we're just gonna pump this up here. Oh, I can hear it leaking out of my thing. All right, we're gonna put it to about 7 psi. You can see the needles right there, and it's not moving thus far, but we'll leave it be for a couple minutes, make sure that it doesn't drop. And if it doesn't, then we know for a fact that the cooling system is 100% sealed. So when we go to put coolant in it, we should not have any leaks at all.
Don't have any idea what you're talking about. It's like, but like,
Okay, this is good.
It's bolted on the seal.
Yeah. Gaskets that you're definitely going to need is a downpipe gasket, and it is not included in the gasket kit. Ding. So we use the Grimspeed ones again, just because they have a nice density to them. I've never had one leak. And we're going to slip that onto the turbo. Okay, that's on there. All right, now I have to crawl underneath. So let me grab the downpipe out of the back of the car. Yeah, there we go. Now I gotta get this onto its mount tab. There we go. Okay. You know, it's been a minute since I worked on the floor. I've been spoiled with these lifts. There's something relaxing about working on the floor though. And just like, you ever been working on your car on the floor and then you just fight something and then you just lay here like this for like 10 minutes? Just reevaluate your life and why you started to do the things that you're doing. So we're gonna be putting this little heat shield bracket on. Okay, those are started. This stud pulled out with the nut, so we're just gonna thread it back in like normal. These two, that's down here. This one's notoriously hard to get to anyway, so I might save this one for when the car is up in the air. I think I'm gonna do that. That's okay. Okay, again, there's one more downpipe bolt that is really hard to get to from the top, so we're just gonna do it from the bottom when we get it on the lift. We can, however, get this wideband sensor into the downpipe. It's an aftermarket one, so if you don't have this, don't sweat. It's aftermarket. Okay, it is time for the top mount intercooler. I'm gonna grab that and the heat shield for the turbo. Putting on this top mount can be somewhat challenging for your first time. I'm gonna give you a couple tips here. First off, make sure that this clamp is nice and loose. Not too loose, but loose enough. Same with this one. And you're definitely going to want a hook tool like this. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get it situated to where it's 90% of the way on, but maybe this is like folded in like this on the turbo, right? All I'm gonna do is hook it in there and use this to just kind of fix that so it slides on. That should do it. It works 99% of the time. Of course, I say that now, so it won't, you know. All right, so we're gonna get this out of the way. Get that, oh, get that onto there. Okay, and then, yeah, just like I said, so if you look right here, it's just kind of caught, right? So if you just take this tool, just kind of sneak it around. Like that. Ooh, this one's fighting me too. Okay. Pretty sure, yep, see, it just walked itself on. And then from there, you just need like a pry bar or a long screwdriver just to get it the rest of the way on. So we'll just use this guy. Okay, that's on. Now we can get this guy here, get him bolted down. Something I find very odd is that in the factory gasket kit, they don't include a downpipe gasket, but they do include a top mount bypass valve gasket. It's just kind of strange to me. Since we did all of the oiled components yesterday, we should be able to. All right, now we're just going to be hooking up some vacuum lines and the breather hoses on this electronic boost control solenoid here. He's got his hoses laying out, and by he I mean me. So we're gonna get those tidied up. Easy thing to remember for all of these electronic boost control solenoids. If you're on an internal wastegate, the 3 goes to the wastegate, or 3 goes to the turbo, 2 goes to the wastegate. So there's numbered. 1 goes back to the inlet, if you're curious. Okay, so 3 to the turbo, 2 to the wastegate. Again, definitely should have done this on the stand, but we're here now, so it is what it is. Okay, boost controller lines are on. We need to get the rest of the PCV system running, and I actually saw a couple of random hoses in here. Yeah, that's what these are going to be. Okay, there's that one and this one. Definitely should have put this one on before because it's tricky to get to. I'm actually just going to pull the battery out real quick. Pull the battery out anyway, it needs replaced. All right, last thing is bolt the air intake on, throw oil in it, and it should start. Should. Getting a little suspicious, Richard. This build's going a little too smooth. Usually something bad happens by now. Okay. Get this coupler on and tight. All right. I don't know if my hose reel will fit all the way over here. Okay. For startup, we just have some bulk 540 conventional oil. We'll run the car for about 10 minutes with this oil in it, and then we'll switch it out. But there's absolutely no sense putting in a really nice synthetic oil just for startup because you're going to drain it out right away anyway. So this will just catch all the initial contaminants, you know, assembly lube, ARP lube, all that stuff. This is going to catch all that and we'll drain it all out afterwards. All right, we just threw a fresh battery in it because this thing was flat dead when it showed up. Ooh, we have a fuel leak here. So that's not good. But that was something that we didn't do, so we'll have to fix that. Anyway, well, we know that it makes fuel pressure, so that's good. Let's see if this is going to be as simple as just tightening the clamp a little bit. It's not. Okay, I'm gonna have to get a chunk of hose and replace that. You can see right here, just as I added battery power, the fuel pump's turned on because the key was on, and it just started seeping out of right there. So we're just gonna get this loose. It might spray, so be careful. Come on. There it goes. Okay. Yeah, that clamp was just completely bottomed out. I actually have a clamp that'll probably work better for this. I will say, though, he did have the correct type of clamp on, so that's good. I will say, though, he did have the correct type of clamp on, so that's good. All right. Let's get the AC line on, since I haven't done that yet. And that might be a little bit of a challenge. We'll save that for later. We'll do that later off camera. I'm going to put the car back on our wood blocks real quick. I just need to put a couple more bell housing bolts on and verify the engine mounts, and then we'll start it. So we're under the car now, and I have some hardware here. We're going to get the lower studs bolted down, as well as the rest of the bell housing bolts and the motor mounts. Thankfully, the engine mounts did fall into the correct space, so we did not have to hit them with a hammer to seat them. Put that there while we're at it. That's just a mount bolt for the downpipe. And we'll get down under here. I don't know if I'll be able to get this one super tight without a tool. Or with the downpipe on at least. Kind of put the horse in front of the wagon on that one. Or is it wagon in front of the horse? Yeah, wagon in front of the horse. That's the saying. It would have started and ran just fine with these bolts out, but while they're fresh on my mind, might as well throw them in. I guess with me doing this on the floor, it really does show that if you have the time, you can do this job at home. Oh yeah, that's it. I should have done that a minute ago. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. All right, now we're safe to start it. Again, we're going to start it with zero coolant in the car. That's standard practice here at Off the Line, just because if you have any sort of oil leak or vacuum leak and you need to take the car back apart, you don't have to then drain the coolant. So we're going to start it for just a couple seconds without coolant in it. We'll check for oil leaks, and then we'll start filling it with the coolant. Set to go? Don't you love it when it just starts up? 2 or 3 cranks. That's the best. All right, so now that it's running, it's got oil pressure. I'm checking for oil leaks with my flashlight, looking around the turbocharger area, and just pretty much anywhere that there's oil. The turbo especially is prone for oil leaks, so we're gonna keep our eye on that. All that seems to be okay. I think we're set to go here. All right, we just heard the car fire up for the first time. Only took a couple of cranks, though, so that means that we didn't do anything wrong, which is always confidence inspiring. Right away, I don't see any oil leaks. The only thing left to do now is to do the first oil change. I'm going to fill it up with coolant and let the car get all the way up to operating temperature. A good way to be able to tell that that's happened is when the cooling fans kick on. So I'll let the cooling fans kick on, turn the car off, let it sit for a minute, and then I'll drain all the oil out, put another fresh filter and fresh oil in, and then you can start test driving it, doing your initial engine break-in, not any highway driving, but mostly just city driving. And at least from Outfront's perspective and our perspective, we tend to tell people to change the oil the first 250 and then 500 miles. After that, you can go about 1,000 miles. That seems to work really, really well. And the whole point in doing that is getting all of the initial engine wear out of the oil and out of the filter, getting it in the garbage so you can have fresh, clean oil in the engine while it's being broken in. The most important things to look for are obviously oil leaks. If your car is idling high, you might have a vacuum leak, so a good smoke test would indicate that. Any sort of coolant leaks need to be addressed right away. And if all that's set and you don't have any leaks, it's idling perfect, there's no check engine lights, you're good to start driving it. So if you have any questions about this car, doing your own, any sort of questions, Subaru-based, STI-based, WRX, BRZ, any of them, we deal with these cars all the time. We'd be happy to help. So you can email us, sales@offthelineperformance.com, or you can call us at 515-513-6399. Look forward